Hi, it's May here, and I'm with Virginia Herlihy, who's going to speak to us more about being a working parent and combining that with being an excellent performer at the office, too. Virginia is founder and CEO of How Do You Do It? They've been in operation for over a decade, and they've helped thousands of working parents to combine these dual roles really successfully. And on top of that, they've got a 100% recommendation rate. Don't we all want a 100% recommendation? My goodness, it's amazing. And she and her company have helped people across the globe, companies like Deloitte, Microsoft, and we are really delighted to have Virginia here with us today. Welcome, Virginia.
Thank you, May. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So thanks so much for your wonderful tip on using the language of choice. And I'd like to just broaden out our discussion to ask you first, having worked with thousands of working parents over the last 11 years, what are the kinds of things that they typically find most challenging?
Okay. In fact, the answer to that is very consistent across our groups, and it falls into a couple of categories. One of the things that working parents never have enough of is time. So they're constantly time poor. And they feel like they're racing from one thing to another without much of a break. So they're going from their paid work to their unpaid work and back again. So that means they don't have very much time for themselves, for their important relationships, often their partnership.
Yep.
And they're very stretched on both sides of the fence. They always feel that they're on. So I'd say that the time piece is a really difficult one for them. Then on top of that, they've got guilt or stress about what they're not doing enough of. So instead of actually focusing on...
I'm just going, yes, because I've been a working parent virtually my whole life, and yes, time, guilt.
Yes. Time and guilt, they kind of go
this is exactly
together.
Right.
I think they're born with the first child. The guilt is kind of born with the first child, actually, and so it continues.
Yeah.
So they feel like they're never doing enough. And instead of actually focusing on what they do well, because they're actually incredibly efficient and productive, they tend to focus on what they're not doing enough of. So they give themselves quite a hard time. And then the third thing on top of that is that they are dealing with other people's judgments and perceptions about how well they're doing it. And often this is an area of bias. And that's quite hard to manage as a working parent when people have quite openly share their views, especially people at home, about the way in which you're making decisions about combining work and life. Often unwelcome sharing, but they do it anyway.
Yep.
And the same thing is happening at work. If people do it very differently to you, sometimes they can judge you for doing it wrong in a way, is almost the implication.
Yeah. And do you find, and that of course plays back into the feeling guilty.
Yeah, totally. It just reinforces the circle because what they're trying to do all the time is get it right for everybody, and they can't. So even if you get it right for one person, you'll get it wrong for somebody else. But you're trying all the time to do that.
Yes.
And then when your children get old enough, they'll start saying things too. So, it becomes quite complex.
And do you find that I'm really interested in this third point you made about the judging. You also find, sometimes I would be thinking that others were judging me, and then it would turn out that they weren't actually judging me, and it was kind of in my head.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we work with people a lot about that. We say, so do you know that? Or is that your perception of what somebody else is thinking? So, and it comes a lot from fear. They're worried that they might be thinking that, and they might have had some evidence that somebody has actually thought something negative. Yep. But often it is coming from their own thinking. They're, in a way, they can be their own worst enemy.
Well, I know you're just reminding, I went flashback to when my kids were really little, and I remember rushing back from the office to make it on time for my daughter's violin recital. I can't even remember which instrument it was. They all do something. And I dash in there. I'm late, but I managed to be there just in time for her piece of it. Thank goodness.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, well done. But I'm sweating. It was awful. And afterwards I said, Mommy is so sorry that mommy was late to this thing. I'm so glad I caught you because I'm back there waving to make sure she sees that I'm there. And then she said, oh, well, don't worry, mommy. I didn't really care if you came to this one or not. And I said,
Yes. It'd be nice to know that earlier, right?
well, because I assumed that every single one was important because people at my office were saying, oh, well, you're not going to your daughter's recital.
Yeah, okay, so that you said so, but you've raised another important point, May, because another thing that people do in this space, they apologize a lot. So they say sorry a lot for what
Yep.
they're doing. And sometimes there is no need for an apology. So sometimes the over apologizing can make you feel worse and make you look less confident
Yeah,
about what
well,
you're trying to do.
yes, that's certainly true at the office. And the addendum to that story I just told you was I started to realize that instead of making these assumptions and apologizing all the time, I just sat down with all three of my kids and I said, okay, let's pull out the calendar. Here's all the things, the sports things, the music. Which things do you really want me to be at? And
Yeah.
so that solved a lot of problems. But tell me more about this apology language, because I think that's the sister or cousin of your point about the language of choice.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. So yeah, it goes with it, and it comes from people's thinking. So if they're thinking and feeling guilty about what they're doing, and often what they're focusing on is the part that they're not present for or that they're
Yeah.
not attending, and they're already feeling bad about that, even if they've negotiated that with their workplace. So even if they've negotiated to leave at 5 on a particular day or whatever,
Yeah.
they'll still be feeling guilty because they've left people in the office. So they'll be focusing on the thing that they're not doing. So then they overcompensate for that, and they'll apologize about it or say, look, I'm really sorry. It's just that, using a lot of those words. It's only that. The thing is, and they'll go into more detail than they need to. And actually the end result is that they look less sure and less confident than if they didn't use those words at all and they just left. So
Well,
go on. So one of the things that we talk to people about is when they have made a choice to do something, to do that with some confidence versus to look like there's something wrong with what they're doing, because that will affect people's perceptions of them and make them feel there is something that they're doing wrong.
absolutely. And I love what you're saying about the fact that there are great solutions and simple tweaks that you can make. So through your company, how do you do it? You work with a lot of leading organizations. I mentioned Deloitte, Microsoft. I think you work with Allianz as well. So how do you help these big organizations support their people in being more successful in both places? And, are there special things that you have found make it all work for everybody?
Yeah. So at a big picture level, May, there are three levels that we work at in order to make this work. And one is what the organization is doing to support their people. And that is things like policy, but it's making policy practice, not just having a policy and then nobody applies it.
Right.
It's also what the managers do in terms of managing people who might want to work more flexibly, like a working parent, and what their role is in having conversations, quality conversations with their people about what can work, and focusing on output, not visibility. And the third thing is working with the individuals themselves. And the key for the individuals themselves, the first stage is for them to get clear about what life looks like now. So the example we use on our programs is that when you're running a big project for a client, for example, you don't just start it. You actually step back and you have a bit of a plan. You think about how you're going to manage it, how you're going to resource it, what team you might need. Whereas we come to a big transition like becoming a working parent and we just kind of get on with it. We don't really step back enough and evaluate, well, what does good look like for me now in this? What's important that I look after? And how can I make choices to align with that? And how can I resource myself so that I can align with that? So it's very, very important to do that piece, and people often don't. They're just responding to all these things that are coming at them and kind of living a to-do list of what everybody else wants versus looking inside and saying, how am I going to make this work for me and my family and my work situation?
Mm.
That's a starting point.
Yeah. So if that's a starting point for me as the individual, then what's my next step? How do I communicate that to, or do I need to communicate that to my boss or to my colleagues?
So communication comes a little bit later. So the next step, when you've got some more clarity, and there's a few points to getting clarity, and there's a few things I'd really like to suggest people look at. One is looking at what their bottom lines or their real boundaries are. And what I mean by a bottom line or a boundary, for example, is it going to be okay for you to work on a weekend, or is that family time for you?
Ooh, okay.
What time in the evening are you prepared to work to? How many times a week? So are there certain times where you're saying, I'm going to come in late so I can have breakfast with my child, or come in or leave earlier so I can be back for bath time and bedtime, or depending upon the age of your children? What are your boundaries around that? Be clear on, you'll know when it's gone too far out of whack, that you're not feeling comfortable. And that will affect your productivity at work if you're feeling stressed about how much time you're spending at home. So getting clear on your boundaries and your bottom lines is a really important piece.
Mm-hmm.
And the second piece is looking at who does what from an unpaid perspective. So what I mean by that is if you're in a partnership, and now 2/3 of couples, when you're in a couple, are sharing care and career, who is doing what? So that means on a domestic front, all the data says women do more on that front, and on a childcare front. And so being quite specific about that, so there aren't lots of assumptions of, I thought you were doing that.
Right.
So I thought you were doing that, actually. And they say, there's some research from the Fatherhood Institute in the UK that says couples' arguments go up 5 times when they have children. And often it's around miscommunication or lack of clarity about who is doing what. So the third piece of that is emergency and contingency planning. So you know those arguments you can have with your partner in the morning about whose job's more important or whose meeting is more important because your child is sick and one of you has to stay home?
Yep.
If you pre-negotiate.
and both of us are going, well, mine is.
Exactly. So that's why it's important to have those kinds of conversations up front, so that you know, in this week, this is kind of what's going on for me. That's what's going on for you. So those conversations become easier, and you're not having them when you're already stressed.
So on this third one, what I hear you saying is that one is one that you can do on a weekly basis, as opposed to a set and forget. It's always yours that's more important, always mine.
Yes, absolutely. And that depends on each individual circumstance. Some people it may be more set than that, but certainly with myself and my husband, we used to do a weekly check on that because our diaries would shift and change. So we would have a kind of mini meeting, admittedly with a glass of red wine, but we would have a mini meeting about, what the plan was for the next week, because that was how we managed it.
I love that. And in fact, I think most of us probably on a Sunday night or whatever, we look at the week ahead, and we can just add that in as part of the planning,
Exactly.
for work. I mean, yeah. So one of the things I also really appreciate is, so I take notes when something's really interesting, and I just take some notes. I love this clarity point in about having boundaries and bottom lines and setting that up front. And I'm also well, 2 things. One is, this is all around the clarity piece.
Yes.
Are there other big chunks like clarity that we need to think about?
Yes. So one of the things that we do with our participants when we work with them is we do a values exercise. And we do a values exercise based on where they are now in their lives as combining dual roles. And really, the essence of the values work is around what's important to you about your life and what's important to you about your working life. And if you consider those things, because sometimes you will have what's called a values clash. 2 things are both important to you, but one is more than the other. it's important that you look after those things that you value, because if you look after them, you'll feel better, you'll feel more satisfied. And if you don't, you'll feel more stressed. And
Absolutely.
people often haven't redone that, even if they've done it before, when they become a working parent and their life has changed significantly. So the other part of this is at a more fundamental level about really what drives me, and so therefore what I need to look after now, and how am I going on that?
Yeah, that's really important. And, I'm just thinking back, one of the things that I have always found is that my work is really important to me and my career.
Yeah.
But my family trumps everything. And the way I thought about it was always that, yes, my family is the most important thing, but I spent most of my career trying to set things up to make sure that I never had to make the choice, because I wanted to have this successful working life as well. So I don't know where that falls into your rubric or your.
It's about choice. So
Yeah.
ultimately, what you're doing constantly in your life, whether you're a working parent or not, is you're choosing at this point in your life this over this. And then at another time, you might choose this over this. And it doesn't mean you're not doing aspects of both, but at any given moment, this is taking priority over this part. And
Yeah.
it's checking in with yourself that you're still overall comfortable with that, and not expecting yourself to be 100% on everything, because that's just unrealistic. As a working parent who's chosen two very important parts of your life, work that you really enjoy and a family that you want to be involved in, you're not going to get to a 10 out of 10. And often people feel that they are going to should be at a 10 out of 10 all of the time. And it's just unrealistic.
Absolutely.
And so they put a lot of pressure on themselves. But it is about checking in. If you're feeling, I don't like this term work-life balance, because I think it sets up a nirvana, an expectation that we're going to get to this amazing place.
Yep.
But what I do say to people is, when you're not in balance, when it's not quite right. So when you get that feeling, you tune into it and you start saying, okay, so what might I need to revisit here? Or where do I need to put a bit more attention at the moment and take a bit more attention off something else?
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's also setting up your life, going back to those boundaries, setting up your life the way that you want it to be, so that you do have coverage and you can focus on both things at the right times for yourself.
Well, it's like what you said about your children. I've done the same thing with my children. We teach our participants to do that. Ask them what's most important to them. But also for you, ask yourself what's most important to you, and make sure you're there for those parts. So for me, it didn't matter to me when my children were young, as long as I'd set an overall direction on it, because we had a nanny who would cook the food. But it mattered to me a lot who did some more of the educational things. I mean, I'm an educator, it was bound to.
Right.
So those pieces that I wanted to do, so but you've got to get clear in yourself about what's the most important thing for you. And then you can look after that.
Yes. I love that you made this point, because it is exactly what we tell people at work, right? You focus on your strengths and where you can make a unique contribution, and you go do those things. And you're just saying you can pick and choose those things at home as well.
Absolutely.
Love it.
You don't have to be good. You don't have to be good at all of it. It's not realistic, is it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm a recovering perfectionist. And my mother used to say, May, good enough is good enough. And now I realize that she's exactly right. She's also a pediatrician, so maybe she was teaching me some parenting skills.
Yes. That's a very good statement.
Yeah. And then before I was saying,
the other thing that you were asking me about before, you were mentioning before, was communication. And that was one of the things I wanted to mention in terms of dealing with perceptions. Because the reality is, as well as us having perceptions that we think somebody else is thinking something and they're not, sadly, we do experience in our programs that sometimes people really are thinking those things and they say them. So they
Yeah.
say, in fact, somebody said to me on the extended family front, you're actually, and when somebody says actually, you know you're in for trouble. So you're actually quite, quite, quite a good mother considering you work, right? So that was my
Wow,
backhanded.
that is laden with
That's laden, right?
judgment.
So yeah, and at work, what we've heard an example of is a manager saying to their team member, well, they come back after their first maternity leave. Well, you've had one child, so that means you're probably going to have another child. So there's not really any point in me putting much time into you until you've finished your family. So sadly, we do still hear comments like that even today. So in this dealing with perceptions piece, I think there's a few things I wanted to say about that, if that's okay.
Yeah, this is crucial.
Yes, it's really crucial. So the first thing is, it's really often it's not actually about you, it's about the other person. And so judgment, when we look at judgment and we talk to people about this on our programs, what's judgment really about? Well, really judgment is about the fact that you're doing it differently to me. And in order to make myself right, I have to make you wrong.
Mm.
So that's the first thing to recognize, that sometimes it's not about you.
Yes.
The second thing is just to what we do in the face of that often is we do what we talked about earlier, is we usually over apologize, we over justify, we over explain why we're doing what we're doing to try and make it okay for the other person. And what we do by doing that is we achieve the opposite, which is we look unsure, lacking in confidence, and guilty.
Yeah.
What is a much more useful way to go is to initiate communication about what you're thinking and feeling about your career now, and saying to people, so yes, I am working flexibly, for example, which is where some of this perception comes up, and I am very committed to my career and I'm still ambitious and I want to work on those kinds of projects. Please don't assume, not that you'd say please don't assume, but what you're trying to do is prevent people from assuming on your behalf,
right,
that based on the fact that you're now doing this, that means you don't want that. So that's up to you to go and initiate a conversation to say, let me be clear. These are my career interests and I'm still very interested in that.
Yes, and I think this is so important. And there was a study that said that when men have children, that's viewed as a positive and in the workplace.
Correct.
But when women have children, it results in these questions that come up. And
Correct.
whether people are saying them or not, that's very societally ingrained in us. So
yes, it is.
Are you suggesting that whether you're, well, particularly for women, I guess, coming back from maternity leave, that it's important to take a proactive approach and actually go and say these things?
Yes, absolutely. And preferably to have had these conversations before you go and before you come back to say, let me be clear, I am going on maternity leave, and when I return, at this point, I am still thinking I will be doing this kind of work for this kind of number of hours, versus letting people think, oh, well, I better not. Sometimes it's coming from kindness. The manager thinks, well, I better not overwork that person.
Yes.
So I assume they don't want to do that kind of work. And women who are ambitious don't like that. They don't appreciate that decision being made on their behalf. So it's important that they actually go and have those conversations. And what we say to them is, ask yourself the question, if I was to go and speak to your boss and ask them how clear they are about what you want from your career at this point, would they be able to answer you? And if they would be able to answer you and that your colleagues around you wouldn't be able to answer you, you've got some communicating to do.
I love that. That's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
Absolutely.
About a whole host of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
the comment you made about women, the thing for men is the assumptions people make about men is what they're concerned about is when they ask for any kind of flexible work, they're then worried that the assumption is that they are no longer committed to their career.
Oh, so let's talk about that. Yeah, because you work with parents. You work with
men and women. Yeah.
Yep.
So and that's come out of data as well, that men are concerned about that. And yet it's one of the top things they're looking for. So we need to get men talking about the fact that they want to work flexibly, and so that they can move into doing more of the sharing of the care, just like the women want to often move into doing more of the work. We're sharing both now. And then it needs to be okay in our society for us to have both. But we have quite strong views about what a good mum looks like versus what a good dad looks like.
Yes.
And it's starting to change that. And it takes people having the courage to follow their own version of success, not society's, to shift this.
Yes. And I really think this is such a crucial point that you're making about men also feeling comfortable to go and make the case for flexible working,
Yeah.
because first, it's so important for children to have that father influence as well. And I think on the work front, it is the pivotal thing that will make it okay for everybody to make time for what is important in their lives. You know, when it's
Yes.
just as normal for a man or a woman to take on some flexibility or take leave or whatever it is, then it just becomes people do this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And look, a simple example of that, and I was talking about this today, in fact, in a workshop I was running today. When a working mother comes back to work, having had a period of leave for parental leave, she's often asked about the kind of flexibility that she may need at that point, or
Mm,
then that might have happened. A father will come back, and this is what they tell us, they're completely overlooked. It's almost like business as usual. So there's not an
wow.
immediate, I need to talk to you about if you have any particular needs now. And often when these fathers come back, because they're not taking longer periods of leave at the moment, they've
Yep.
had 2 weeks off, and people are saying, did you have a nice holiday? And they're saying, are you kidding me? And but there's no allowance made for them to be able to do anything different, and yet they're really tired, often
Yep.
really needing to be there to support their partners, but nobody comes to them to talk to them about flexible work, and that's where they get left out. So we need to balance it up.
Yeah, we really need to balance it up. So this then leads to the question, if I'm a leader of a team, if I'm a manager, if I have people reporting to me, then what do you suggest would be good for me to do?
Well, the first thing there is as I've said to you about the individuals in terms of initiating communication, there's research that shows that managers can be what's called tolerant and passive in this space versus proactive. So again, being proactive, being aware of what's happening with your team, and if anybody's in their position where they're returning to work from a major transition like this, initiating a conversation to sit down with them and talk to them about what, if any, needs they might have at this particular point, and stop making assumptions on their behalf about what they might need or want. Talk to them about that and ask them about that, and you'll go a long way to creating a solution. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be to advocate support to the rest of the team. Because if you're a working mother and you've just come back and you've been away for a while, you may have lost a little bit of confidence. So if you're leaving it to me as that working mother to negotiate this and talk to the rest of my team about this and about my arrangements now, versus coming in as the manager and saying, this is what Carol is doing at the moment, she's doing this and I'm fully supportive of it, and can we all support that? It's a big difference in the way
Yeah.
that that's handled.
Yeah. That's a huge difference. And so this has been so eye-opening because when I step back and think about all the great advice you've given, a lot of it is really comes down to having clarity yourself,
Yeah,
having open lines of communications, both proactively from the individual, whether it's the father, the mother, and then for managers to also be proactive about that communication, and actively supporting both parents, both sides of the
yeah,
equation when they come back to work.
correct.
And then
Absolutely.
finally, the big thing I hear you saying is don't leave it to making, don't make assumptions about others, and also
Yes,
don't leave others having to make assumptions because you haven't been clear.
absolutely. Great. That's a great way of putting it, May.
Anything else I've missed in wrapping up
No,
what you've?
I think you wrapped up very well. I think that the thing that I would add to that is to stop being so hard on yourself.
Oh,
That
right. I missed that one because I am hard on
stop
myself
being,
and I forget that one. Okay, don't be hard on yourself. You heard it here.
especially to a recovering perfectionist, I would say. Stop being so stop being so hard on yourself. Stop expecting yourself to be at 10 out of 10 in both parts of your life all of the time. It's not realistic. There's a lot to manage. And focus on what you are doing and what you are achieving versus tending to focus on what you still haven't done yet, would be what I would add.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so I know you have so much wisdom you've shared with us, but if let me ask you this, what is the most important thing for us to do in order to be more successful in our careers?
Okay, so as a working parent, I'm going to say here, the first thing to do is stop worrying about what everybody else is doing because they're likely to be doing it differently to you. And get focused on what's really important to you, your work situation, and your family, and make choices that are aligned with that because that is your new version of success.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Virginia, if people want to go deeper, learn more from you, work with you, how do they do that?
The best place to go is to our website, and it's www.howdoyoudoit.co.uk.
Fantastic. And that link will be below this video. And I would also just add that you work with people outside of the UK, you're
Absolutely.
global,
Absolutely. Yes, we are. And in fact, our website is changing soon to reflect that. That so that it will reflect it's everywhere because we do work all across Europe and we work all across Australasia. So yes, we're much bigger than that.
fantastic. So I want to thank you again, Virginia. And I want to thank you for joining us here at Career Mastery Kickstart. If you enjoyed this conversation, if you have questions for Virginia, please scroll on down and leave a comment. We would love to hear from you. And now I want you to get out there, take action, and let's get your career off to a great start this year.